Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Chris Konchak, Senior Director of Traffic Safety and Government Relations with Responsibility.org. We established and lead the coalition known as NASID, or the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving, the host of today's webinar, Stop Repeat Drunk Drivers, Compliance-Based Removal of Ignition Interlocks and Other Best Practices. I will serve as the moderator. I'm happy to introduce the board chairman of NASID and the CEO of the Governor's Highway Safety Association, Jonathan Atkins.
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. I'm honored to briefly kick this webinar off, not only as the chair of NASID, but also as the head of the Governor's Highway Safety Association. And I welcome you today also on behalf of Deborah Coffey, who with Smart Start, who serves on our executive committee, and Dr. Darren Grondell, who also serves on the executive committee and is the director of NASID. It's been a big couple weeks in impaired driving, right? Everyone, I hope, is aware that there was an effort in Congress just a couple weeks ago to push back on impaired driving technology that was passed in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Many thanks to MAD, who led an effort to push back on that pushback and defeat the effort to defund this new technology. Not only was MAD leading the effort, but NASID played a big role of that, and the members of NASID. It was a great coalition across the country that was successful in educating members of Congress about the benefits of impaired driving technology and what that holds in the future. But that's in the future. If everything goes according to plan and under best case scenario, we're 10 years or more away from that technology being out there. We can't wait. We've got to end impaired driving now. And one of the best ways to do that is through strong ignition interlock laws. And that's really why we're having this webinar today, to find out what the best practices are and how we increase compliance. And so you've heard enough from me. There's a lot of great stuff coming on this webinar, and I'm going to turn it back to Chris.
Thanks, Jonathan. If your organization is interested in joining NASID, please fill out the form that is in the chat box, or you can click on Join NASID at nasid.org. The coalition of members and supporters of NASID are working tirelessly to eliminate all forms of impaired driving, especially multi-substance impaired driving. We are honored to have three great leaders from the traffic safety community on our panel today. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be reading their bios, but they will be posted at nasid.org. We will also be emailing out this afternoon or tomorrow morning the slide presentation, a recording of the webinar, and links to the key documents that will be discussed today to everyone who registered for the webinar. Our first speaker will be Tara Casanova-Powell, the CEO for the Association of Transportation Safety Information Professionals and the principal at Casanova-Powell Consulting. The second speaker is Brian Orsino, the Director of Law Enforcement with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. And our final speaker will be Dr. Tara Kelly Baker, the Impaired Driving Division Chief for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Wow, too many acronyms that I've been trying to say and then spread them out. Sorry about that. But we'll get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Tara Casanova-Powell.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you inviting me to present this information and the research that we did on behalf of GHSA. So we can move to the next slide. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Ryan Smith, who also worked on this project with me. Obviously, the GHSA was contracted us to do this research, and the funding was by Consumer Safety Technology and Interlocks. I'd also like to acknowledge the states that participated in this project as well, and the arduous task of getting us this data. The Arkansas Department of Finance and Administration, the Revenue Division, and the Office of Driver Services, the Iowa Department of Transportation Systems and Administration Division, the Tennessee Highway Patrol Research Planning and Development Division, and the Ignition Interlock Device Program, and the Washington Traffic Safety Commission and the Washington Department of Licensing and Public Records Division. So we can move to the next slide, please. So the National Center for Statistics and Analysis, NCSA, which is an office of NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, reported that in 2021, a total of 13,384 people were killed in impaired driving crashes, alcohol impaired driving crashes. And this accounted for 31% of all of the fatal crashes, which is a 14% increase from 2020. NHTSA's early estimates of the traffic fatalities for 2022 shows that an estimated 42,795 people died in motor vehicle crashes. And this represents only a marginal decrease of about 0.3% compared to the fatalities that occurred in 2021. We have not yet received the crash reports for the impaired driving crashes, but we can assume that there probably wasn't as much of a decrease either. And research has shown that repeat offenders are more likely to be involved in fatal crashes. The research has also shown that about a third of all drivers that are arrested for DWIs are repeat offenders. The fatal crash risk has also increased with the number of prior DWI arrests. So when we look at these studies that report as high as 47% recidivism, it is a colossal understatement to say that we have a significant problem here in the United States regarding impaired driving. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about in the next 12 minutes or so. The study that I'm going to be presenting is looked at the impact of the ignition interlock device compliance-based removal laws and the recidivism rates of those states that have and those who do not have compliance-based removal laws. The hypothesis is that the states that do have a compliance-based removal law would have a lower recidivism rate and greater compliance on the interlock than those who do not. And there was a comprehensive law review that was conducted and looking at state level ignition interlock device laws. We selected those states that had all offender laws and then performed the recidivism analyses. And there were two measures of recidivism: those who were arrested for subsequent DWI offenses, and then those who were extended on the interlock during the time that they had the interlock installed in their vehicle. Next slide, please. So before I begin, I want to make sure that everybody knows what a compliance-based removal law is. So compliance-based removal laws establish that those offenders that are required to install an ignition interlock must have a certain predetermined amount of time that they don't have any alcohol or any positive alcohol reports on the ignition interlock. Most of these compliance-based removal terms are 6 months, some are 4 months, but within that last 4 months of their term that they have to have their interlock installed in the vehicle, they cannot have any positive blows recorded. So what we did with regard to trying to identify states that had an ignition interlock law and those that had a compliance-based removal law attached to the ignition interlock law, we did an extensive law review. And there were 33 states that do have a compliance-based removal law. Now, the compliance-based removal in these different states vary. Some are with just very specific violations, including alcohol blows, but some laws will extend the interlock even if it's for non-payment or other non-compliance, such as tampering or things like that. We did also reach out to the state highway safety offices and motor vehicle agencies to be able to confirm that the ignition interlock law and compliance-based removal law, that we were understanding it correctly, and to see if they can provide data for us. So the 4 states that participated in this project, Tennessee and Washington, they were the 2 compliance-based removal states, and then Arkansas and Iowa, and those are the 2 states that were not that did not have a compliance-based removal law. So next slide, please. So when we requested these data elements, we only asked for arrests, convictions, when the ignition interlock was installed, and when it was removed. And we asked for these elements in a 3-year period between January of 2016 and December 31st of 2019. We didn't want to get into the pandemic time because there were a lot of confounding elements in the data outside of putting in that the pandemic issue. So we kept it to those 3 years. And we did look at some descriptive statistics. We did this in the form of a flow chart, which I'm going to explain in a minute, to identify various different program elements of the program, including how often there were repeat offenses, what the compliance rates were, and to identify how complete the data was. There were an extraordinary amount of confounding factors. The lack of data quality is really surprising, and the amount of cleaning and synthesizing that we had to do, and not to point to these 4 states, they were fantastic. These are the states that were able to get us the data. We looked at several other states that were just not able to get us this data in the time that we had asked for. So it's just that this data is messy. Impaired driving data is messy all around. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is to try to make this data better. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about the compliance-based removal recidivism results as a result of those laws. So next slide, please. Fantastic. So these are the variables that we were able to collect or that were provided by each state. And I just want you to note that the variables that were provided for each state are not only different, but even the variables that represent the same things across these 4 states have different terms. So even when we got the data from the states, and we only asked for very few variables to do this recidivism analyses, you can see the differences. So this was a considerable amount of work to do the cleaning and synthesizing the data. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go into this very, very busy slide, but what we did to make some sense of the data and to separate the data and group the data with regard to what we were going to use for the recidivism analysis and to get the descriptive statistics, we created this flow chart so we can illustrate how we sorted and defined the data for both of these different analyses. Next slide, please. So when we were looking at recidivism, there were 2 measures of recidivism that we looked at. We looked at recidivism based on subsequent offenses. So that is a rearrest. And this was calculated as a percentage of the offenders that had a rearrest following the installation removal. Or following the installation. So Tennessee and Washington, which are the 2 states that had compliance-based removal laws, they had the lowest recidivism rates of 1.7% and 3.7%, whereas Arkansas and Iowa, who do not have compliance-based removal laws, they had higher recidivism rates at 5.6 and 6%. Now, we also looked at a secondary measure to identify recidivism, and these were extensions on the interlock device. And Tennessee had the lowest recidivism rate with 11.5%, and Washington had the highest. Now, these are both compliance-based removal states, so it may seem contradictory that Washington had the highest rate of recidivism. However, with this analysis, the data quality was considerably low, and several data had to be dumped for one reason or another when looking at this particular type of recidivism. And this was mostly due to either incomplete or seemingly inaccurate data that was provided. So another factor is that Washington state data was extremely robust, and we had much less confounding issues. And this is likely because their data was so good that the recidivism rate that's based on extensions is more accurate than the other states where was not appropriately represented. So when we're looking at extensions, Washington just provided so much data for us that it probably inflated that number, and it's not really equal to the other states with regard to the data that was provided. But we wanted to be able to show this analysis as well. Next slide, please. So here you can see the recidivism rates by each state, and I've already gone over them with you. You can see that, again, the recidivism when we're looking at subsequent arrest, this is probably the most accurate recidivism analyses that we did. I explained why recidivism 2, looking at extensions, was messy, but then this provides the rationale for further research in this regard. Next slide, please. So I did mention throughout the previous slides that there were significant limitations to this study. Recidivism studies at a minimum should utilize data from multiple sources over at least a 5-year period with several examples for each cohort. And recidivism studies, just by the way that they're structured, are limited when the length of the data set is less than 5 years. But we did have these limitations, so we did the best with what we could. There were other states that were approached for this study, but there were significant barriers to providing this requested data in a timely manner. So this is actually indicative of a much larger problem, that states rely heavily on these data to determine the effectiveness of policy and programs and effective countermeasures that will improve driving safety, but the data is very inconsistent and oftentimes very difficult to access and to analyze and to reliably interpret. So these extensions that we looked at, we weren't sure if they were simply a driver's decision to delay their removal on their own or if they were mandated. So there was some assumptions that were made in that regard, which is why, again, we're really not relying on the recidivism 2 analyses. It's the subsequent arrests that we were looking at for the main teeth of this report. Next slide, please. So when looking ahead to what are the next steps and where do we go from here, what do we do with this information? This is an early indication, a very baseline study that shows that states that do have ignition interlock device compliance-based removal laws had lower recidivism rates or subsequent arrests. This also provides a rationale that states should consider implementing these laws if they don't currently have them, and strengthen the ones that they do have if they are extending for reasons other than subsequent arrests, and that this can impact the number of impaired driving arrests and therefore our serious injuries and fatalities. Next slide, please. So, like I said, this is a baseline data report, and we have a lot of different states that were not able to participate because of the limitations with the data, but this gives us a starting point where we can look at this relationship between compliance-based removal laws and how they affect recidivism. And this is just, again, a jumping off point where we can provide future research and do more to identify this as a factor to reduce impaired driving events. Next slide. We are going to hold the questions to the end, so that's all for me, and I will leave the floor to our next presenter.
And Brian, I'm going to jump in real quick. I forgot to mention, but Tara did just say it. We will take questions and answers at the end. And if you post any questions that you have in the Q&A box, we'll be monitoring that and get to as many as we can when all the speakers have completed. All right, Brian, sorry.
That's okay, Chris. Thank you. And thank you, Tara. Next slide, please. I would first like to thank NASID for inviting AMVA and myself to be on this panel. For anyone on the call who's not familiar with the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, we are a North American association that represents all the motor vehicle administrations, more commonly referred to as the DMVs. But in addition, what a lot of people don't know is that every state and provincial law enforcement agency is also an AMVA member. So that is who we are. Next slide, please. And on my screen, it's not advanced. There it is. Thank you. In 2014, this is how long AMVA has been immersed in the ignition interlock issue. We created our first ignition interlock working group, and we published our original best practices document in August of 2015. Next slide. But because it is such a fluid and moving environment, the working group was reinstituted to update that original document, and we published edition 2 in August of 2018. Next slide. And that brings us to today. We again reinstituted the working group, and each time we changed from working group to working group, we tried to roll over some members from the previous work group, as well as get fresh eyes and new people on our working group. So we just recently published, as of last month, our third edition of our Ignition Interlock Program Best Practices Guide. This slide shows you a snapshot of our table of contents. I'm not going to read all the chapters. You can see them, but it gives you an idea of the content. What you see in red is what I really wanted to highlight in my limited time to make this presentation. Chapter 6 is a new chapter that did not exist in our first and second edition, where we created a new chapter that describes what we believe are best practices around ignition interlock device program administration. Chapter 8 is also a new chapter, and one I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive in just a few minutes. Basics for law enforcement roadside ignition interlock interaction. Chapter 9 is a new chapter talking about reciprocity. And then Appendix D, which existed previously, but I wanted to draw attention to it during this presentation, is our model ignition interlock program legislation. Next slide, please. And I apologize for the pause. I'm waiting for the slide to change. There we go. Chapter 8. This is the new chapter described roadside ignition interlock interaction basics for law enforcement. What we've experienced through a lot of interactions with our law enforcement members is that a lot of our roadside folks, primarily the state troopers that are actually AMVA members, but this obviously extends to municipal police agencies and county sheriff's departments, that a lot of officers really aren't trained or sure what to do if they stop a vehicle that is equipped with an ignition interlock device. In addition, if they stop a vehicle and the driver presents to them a driving credential or a driver's license that has an ignition interlock restriction on it, sometimes they're not sure how to determine whether or not they're in compliance with that restriction. And more importantly, what do they do if they determine the person is not in compliance with that driver's license ignition interlock restriction? So I just highlight a couple of the recommendations that are in our best practices document. And of course, I encourage everyone to download the entire document and look at the recommendations throughout the document. But I'm going to highlight these two. That number one, jurisdictions in the AMVA vernacular, jurisdictions we refer to, we're mainly referring to states, provinces, and territories. That those jurisdictions should include ignition interlock device basics as part of their impaired driving training, more specifically impaired driving training for law enforcement, either through basic academy, post-academy curriculum, and or recurring and service training. Recommendation 8.2, or the second recommendation in chapter 8, is for law enforcement training administrators, basically your academy commanders and administrators, to work with the jurisdiction's ignition interlock program and administrators to develop the appropriate ignition interlock device curriculum that should be in law enforcement basic and recurring training. Next slide, please. Sometimes the agency or entity that is charged with primary responsibility for ignition interlock program administration, really it's all over the map. In some jurisdictions, it's the DMV. In some jurisdictions, it's the state police or highway patrol. In other jurisdictions, it's Department of Transportation. Just requires a lot of high-level coordination between those entities in that particular jurisdiction. Here's why I want to talk about reciprocity. And again, this is a new chapter in our third edition document. What we have determined or found out through experiences, a lot of times a person will get an ignition interlock requirement and get a device installed on their vehicle, but then they'll change residence and cross boundaries. For example, they'll get an ignition interlock installed as a requirement in the state of Washington and then move to California. And that becomes a problem if the ignition interlock laws in those two states are not in alignment, if the requirements are different, whose requirements prevail over the others, and more importantly, who has oversight responsibility and enforcement responsibility if a recipient is found to be out of compliance. So in this chapter, we outline, first of all, the problem, but we also talk about some things that AMVA is working on to bridge the gap between what is currently being done, which in many cases is nothing, and a solution that can be applied throughout North America to ensure that when a program recipient moves across boundaries, that it is seamless and that their requirements are monitored and they can successfully comply with the jurisdiction's program requirements regardless of where they live. Next slide, please. So we also include model legislation as appendices to our document. And we really encourage the jurisdictions to, I mean, everyone's got impaired driving law, and most everyone has some form of an ignition interlock law. We encourage jurisdictions to look at their current law and benchmark it against our model legislation to help you identify gaps and opportunities for improvement. And I can speak from experience. I'm from Washington State. Before coming to AMVA, I was with the Washington State Patrol and was and currently remain a member of the Washington Impaired Driving Advisory Council, or WIDAC, for the governor. One of the things we do every interim between sessions is we look at all of our impaired driving laws, whether they're specific to ignition interlocks or not, and identify areas for improvement. We go back virtually every single session with ideas for improving our legislation. So that's what we encourage everyone to do, is look at your legislation, compare it to best practices such as the model legislation we have in our document, identify your gaps or opportunities for improvement, and drop new legislation to make your laws as solid as they possibly can be. Next slide. So I already talked about our chapter 8 in our document, talking about providing steps for law enforcement interaction at roadside, but we also have an adjunct product. It's actually a law enforcement training video. Now, this video was actually funded by NHTSA, although AMVA administered the project back in 2018, along with our Edition 2 document. It is an 11-minute video. Our third iteration of our working group reviewed the video to determine if it was still accurate, contemporary, and could be reused when we released our new document in 2023. And we determined that it was 99% accurate. We did refresh just a couple pieces of that 2018 video, but so it's been refreshed and it's been re-released in November of 2023. Again, it's 11 minutes. and it augments but does not replace Chapter 8 of our document. We encourage our law enforcement agencies to incorporate the video into their basic impaired driving training curriculum. Again, it's only 11 minutes, so it's an easy add-on. And all of these products that I've mentioned, both the document and the video, are available at no cost from the AMVA website, aamva.org, or you can reach out to me directly and I can help navigate you to those products. Next slide, please. So that concludes my piece, and I will turn it over now to Tara from NHTSA. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Brian and Tara. Always hard to follow your presentations. I appreciate being here. Next slide. So hopefully it is no surprise that NHTSA supports state laws requiring ignition interlocks for all convicted DWI offenders, and also supports the development of tools and resources that assist in establishing and strengthening state ignition interlock programs. I'm sure you're also aware that all 50 states and DC allow or even require ignition interlocks to be used for some DWI offenders. But each state program is unique and at different stages of development. States vary in terms of the agencies involved in the delivery of the interlock programs, their structures, authority, and operational practices. So today I'm going to briefly share with you a bit about NHTSA's history with ignition interlocks, including model specifications, some of our publications, and the education and assistance that we do to support interlock programs. I'm also going to discuss some of the challenges states have in implementing their interlock programs effectively, and potentially share some solutions from our angle. But I want to stress that as a federal agency, NHTSA's headquarters can only do so much. So I'm really imploring all of you to also help with some of these solutions. Next slide. So let me begin with model specifications. In 1992, NHTSA adopted and published the model specifications for ignition interlock devices, excuse me. Prior to this, a number of states enacted laws authorizing what they had as certified ignition interlocks. However, there really was no single standard or test procedure among states for actually certifying interlocks. So the federal government developed and issued standards and test requirements to provide a degree of consistency. These have all been updated and revised a number of times. Our latest model specs and the CPLs and PBTs and so forth, as you're seeing on the slide, all fall on one landing page, which is nice and convenient on NHTSA's landing page. You can also Google NHTSA alcohol measurement devices and find these. Next slide, please. So since the late 80s, when the House issued the order, NHTSA has been conducting research and releasing publications and guidelines for state interlock programs. So the images you're seeing right now just show a variety of different examples. Included in our list of publications are the model guidelines for state ignition interlock programs and toolkit, what you need to know, a toolkit for policymakers, highway safety professionals, and advocates. Most recently, we published the state of the practice of alcohol ignition interlock programs, some of the findings of which I'm going to be sharing with you today. These results shed light onto some of the challenges that need to be addressed in order for interlocks to reach their greatest potential. Next slide. So in addition to publications, NHTSA also provides and supports training and education on ignition interlock devices and programs. We have been supporting the Association of Ignition Interlock Program Administrators, APA, since 2011 to create a nationwide communication and training forum for sharing among state ignition interlock program professionals. Additionally, our DWI courts and our judicial outreach liaisons share information and training on the effectiveness of interlocks, and they widely promote them as a very viable tool. So additionally, many of you might already know, interlocks are highlighted in the countermeasures that work, which often is seen as the NHTSA Bible. And we also highlight them in our impaired driving assessments, where we strongly encourage interlock programs to be included in DWI task forces and have policymaker have a policymaker toolkit for interlocks. Of recent, we've supported technical assistance on interlock programs for approximately 40 states, and we continue to do so. Next slide. So by now, we all know that the advantages of having an effective interlock program, but there has been growing concern on the relatively low interlock use rates compared to the number of DWI offenders. And there is a need to identify ways to increase their use. As I mentioned, today I'm going to share with you some of the challenges that we have identified in implementing an effective interlock program. We recently published the State of Practice of Alcohol Ignition Interlock Programs. This project documented the state of the practice of interlock programs across the country. And it focused on key areas like legislation, program funding, data management, vendor oversight, interlock technology, and monitoring driver compliance. So I'm going to review some of these findings from the report, but what I'm sharing today isn't just about what's in from the report, but also from talking with partners who also work in the space, talking to our regions and their states, as well as what we've learned from our own impaired driving assessments. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start with legislation. We know from the research done in the State of Practice report and discussions with program staff that state employees are not allowed to lobby legislators. Therefore, they really need champions to do that on their behalf, and this can be pretty tough to come by. States are also limited by the number of bills they can introduce during the legislative session. This often spans several departments in the continuum of transportation issues. So moving interlocks or any road safety proposals can be difficult due to competing priorities. There is often a lack of political leadership. For example, legislators are hesitant to put forth programs that could increase cost to participants. And they often lack education about interlock technology and its effectiveness. And finally, even once legislation is passed, laws vary in many ways, which complicates how programs are implemented and enforced. And these can include factors that trigger the requirement for an offender to have an interlock, just general program implementation, authorities, penalties, and so forth. Next slide, please. So we also know data management is a challenge. It's a substantial undertaking. Interlock data is collected across programs, but it's often not usable and fails to inform program improvements. This is because of inadequate or inconsistent data collection. As Tara's presentation showed you, consistency is key when we want to see patterns and improve our programs. Things that may be contributing that we've learned to inconsistent data collection are budget constraints, inadequate staffing, limited data systems, and often the data that is collected, which is a big part of it, is often owned by vendors, and this makes them often unusable or inaccessible to program staff. Next slide, please. Related to data is monitoring and driver compliance. Probably the biggest and most discussed challenge with interlock programs lies with monitoring of driver compliance. Research has shown that monitoring offenders for violations, followed by the imposition of responses, increases compliance. In fact, compliance-based removal has been adopted by many states for this reason. But a lot more needs to be done to increase monitoring, and there are a number of challenges that we have heard about. The responsibility for monitoring and imposing responses varies by state, and they each have their own unique challenges. Some states don't monitor because of lack of authority to impose any type of consequences. Others lack data systems, or those data systems are inadequate. Budget constraints are often cited as another challenge, and generally lack of staff. So a lot of resource challenges that our states have to contend with. And sadly, with regards to monitoring, sanctions have been reported to rarely be imposed. And methods to provide notices of non-compliance also vary. So these use of letters or using state patrols vary by state. Finally, who actually receives the data varies, and sadly, often it does not include the judge. Next slide, please. So education and training. We also know that education and training have their challenges. Interlocks are proven most effective while installed, but they show effectiveness post-removal with treatment. To be most effective, offenders need to be screened and assessed for potential recidivism, and they need to be matched with the most appropriate education and treatment while they're on the interlock. There are limited, if any, coordinated efforts around education and treatment for the offender. And of course, a big reason for this limitation is we're relying on the data and monitoring to show how the offender is performing. And as also mentioned previously, there's a lack of reporting to judges for effective sanctioning. So next slide, please. All right, so solutions. Let me offer a few solutions. By no means are these the panacea. They're not the only solutions, but there's some of the things that we have learned from states who have been successful. One of the most important things a state needs to do to improve the interlock program is to identify their gaps in the state's laws and enforcement efforts. I cannot reiterate this. And there's lots of ways to look at your laws. The National Conference of State Legislators, they recently put out a brief entitled States Identify Effective Ignition Interlock Countermeasures to Fight DUIs. In this report, in this brief that I hope you look at, they highlight what some states are doing to strengthen their interlock laws. And these include requiring all offenders to install interlocks, granting immediate provisional license upon installation, removing the ability to wait out the interlock period, requiring installation upon chemical test refusal, and enacting compliance-based removal provisions. So the second thing that we need is advocates. We need advocates to help implement and improve legislation. We need to find those champions. Again, not necessarily something NHTSA states can often do, so we really are looking to community advocates, and you need to look for them in your community. Finally, I encourage you to look to other states with strong interlock laws and programs, and of course, to look at the newly released AMVA guide, as Brian was just sharing. Look at that Appendix D on model legislation. Next slide. Okay, so next I'm going to suggest that you look at your data. Data is essential. Again, I know we might sound like broken records since you just heard from Tara about the importance of data and good data. States report that data are often limited and unavailable for varying degrees. You might consider developing some type of data workflow or some type of data plan map for your program, where you start from the point of entry, from the user's point of entry all the way to their exit. This is a useful exercise for identifying available data and data gaps. So key issues for you to consider when you are looking at your data is what kind of data needs to actually be collected, and who should be collecting the data, and really importantly, how is the data shared with partners? Identifying data gaps allows you to determine the data collection priorities. And of course, timeliness of that data really matters, especially if it's going to be used and should be used to educate interlock users and support treatment. So I want to, the document on the side of this slide is one resource to look at. The Traffic Injury Research Foundation's publication on data management systems, and their implementation is available to you. This is an area that NHTSA can and will assist with technical assistance and guidance. So should data management be a challenge for your state, definitely reach out to NHTSA. Next slide. All right, finally, a lot has been already published to help states implement the best standards, and I really encourage you to seek these out. One example is CDC with NHTSA published Increasing Alcohol Ignition Interlock Use, Successful Practices for States. This is another brief. It details 8 different program keys that can be used to strengthen state programs. Another publication, of course, is the AMVA's newly released Best Practices Guide. And NHTSA also has a number of opportunities to help states improve their programs. States can participate in impaired driving assessments, where they get subject matter experts to evaluate and make recommendations. NHTSA can also provide education and training to states that are seeking assistance in this area. Hopefully, we're NHTSA in the new future. We're hoping to pull together a summit to bring stakeholders and other partners together to discuss what more needs to be done. Not only to advance the use of interlocks, but really to support robust interlock programs. NHTSA supports interlock programs because they have the greatest potential. We want states to implement programs that can generate maximum benefits and stop impaired driving. So we know there always will be challenges, but there are also solutions. So next slide. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, want any of the resources that I shared, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tara and Brian and Tara. We had great presentations. We now have some time for a few questions. Please post in the Q&A box, and I'll be looking there for questions to post. One that we had, I'm just going to read it. Connecting ignition interlock laws with monitoring and responses rarely seems to be part of the conversation and bills put forth for legislation. States like Michigan, use with sobriety courts, in Florida requiring treatment with 3 lockouts have done so and have research to support it. Do the model legislation and or guides include these aspects? Why aren't monitoring and responses are larger part of the conversation and bills put forth?
I'll jump in, Chris, on that. In the AMVA document, we highlight a program in Washington State, which only touches on a portion of the question, but it's an important part. Washington State was very fortunate, and we had a legislator who was successful in getting the Washington State Patrol resources, so that they have troopers whose full-time job is ignition interlock enforcement and monitoring. So in other words, they will actually go to people's houses and do a knock and talk and say, hey, you were ordered by the court, or you were ordered by the department licensing to have an ignition interlock. I need to see your car and see that you've gotten it installed. So that covers one piece of the monitoring enforcement that I think the questioner was asking. And that is included in our document, a full description of that program and how it works.
Great.
I'd actually like to jump in on that as well. When we look at our compliance-based removal laws, there is an element of monitoring there. We do need to identify whether or not there has been a positive alcohol result while they are on the ignition interlock. And that is the reason for the extension of the interlock time with a compliance-based removal law. So with these compliance-based removal laws, there is an element of monitoring. Again, with administrative ignition interlock requirements, oftentimes outside of Washington State that does that home check. Oftentimes it's just left to the DMV, and they don't have the resources simply to do that kind of monitoring. So this is something that some states have developed within their diversion programs, within their treatment courts, where they identify a group like a community corrections, or have a specific group like Oregon to do the monitoring of the ignition interlock while they're in these different programs. But you're right, monitoring should definitely be part of the legislation, and the resources to allocate those responsible for doing the monitoring and to monitor appropriately.
I don't know if I have much more to add, except for jumping in on what Tara said. They should be included in model legislation. I think it's important to take a look at AMVA's report. There was obviously NHTSA's. I'm hopeful that we're going to be re-looking at model legislation and really dissecting it. But yes, I agree exactly what Tara said.
Another question, how would panelists respond to policymakers concerned with privacy implications of these proposals? This may be one
Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say that question may not be specific enough for me to, if you're talking about the privacy of the data that's collected by the device, or are there a lot of privacy aspects to the question that I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's probably what the device is collecting, but I don't know. And I think we probably would need a little more information to.
I can actually address that, because that was one of the things that when we are requesting this data, there are privacy concerns because there is personal identifying information that is there when we're trying to identify arrests and subsequent arrests. And I also want to address, I did see a question in the chat, how does someone get rearrested when they're on an interlock? Well, that person may not be driving the vehicle that has the interlock. There's also a multitude of other ways that this can happen. But when we were looking at rearrests, we were looking at during the time that they were on the interlock, and then outside of that as well, if we had that information. But the privacy issues, they can be dealt with when you're requesting data to use a unique identifier. It's really easy for people to do when they're pulling this data, and creating a unique identifier to link different records is something that is fairly standard and something that gets around the privacy issue when they're requesting this data to do this kind of research. And I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. What methods do you think about for improving detection and enforcement while driving? Additionally, what technology solutions exist for monitoring alcohol levels during driving, not interlocks? And again, I think this is one of those things that a lot of research is being done on at this particular time. I don't know that our group that we have assembled is necessarily the experts on that topic, but we may have somebody that feels comfortable talking about that.
I am no expert. And yeah, I don't, I agree with you. I think that there is research and there's a lot of talk on some things that are happening. I don't know if the question also refers to IJA. As many of you know, that bill has requested that NHTSA put out some rulemaking regarding looking at advanced impaired driving technology that passively monitors drunken impaired driving, that it either through performance-based or passively through BACs. So that work is in progress, and an advance notice is to be coming out soon. So I don't have the answers for you now, but I can say that there's a lot being discussed and a lot of research happening.
And I think going down sort of the same path, we had a question that was, what advances are on the horizon for an interlock that goes beyond just alcohol impairment? And again, one of those areas where there's so much work being done at this point, looking at how you monitor for drugs in addition to alcohol. I know that we have some of our partners on this call from the interlock world that produce those devices, and they may have thoughts, and I welcome them to enter any comments that they have in the chat box so that people can see anything that they're thinking about that. But I also, if any of our panelists have any other thoughts on that.
I can talk about the humongous challenge around any kind of device that can accurately detect, first accurately detecting presence, and then beyond presence, what is the level? And many people on this call are probably well aware there are no scientifically based per se limits for most any drugs beyond alcohol, whether it's THC. A lot of states, along with Colorado, Washington was the first state to legalize recreational cannabis, and we grabbed 5 nanograms out of thin air. And there's no scientific basis for 5 nanograms. And I'm just choosing cannabis as an example because when you talk about poly substance abuse mingling with driving, alcohol and cannabis is the highest used combination. Although you can go to any other legal or illegal drug in this conversation. It's near impossible to determine what the appropriate limit ought to be, let alone having a device that will accurately detect it, let alone tell you what level they're at.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on that too, Brian. Everything you said, yes, ditto. But also having the former chair of the Impairment and Transportation Committee on this panel, Tara Kelly Baker, and now I am the chair of this committee. This is something that we are actually looking at as one of our key topics, and something that is going to be the focus of our mid-year meeting for the Transportation Research Board. So if anyone is interested in perhaps investigating this further with our committee, or interested in joining our committee as a friend or a member, please contact me or put your information in the chat, and we'll get you on that list.
And one other question, what were some of the data issues states have regarding DUI arrest data, and why isn't this information more readily available?
I can jump on that one. Some of the data issues are just simply that the way that the data is collected with impaired driving offenses, it's very linear. It's not aggregate. They follow individuals. So being able to identify subsequent arrests is going to, and then if that arrest was adjudicated or not, can be difficult. Oftentimes arrests in certain states are not documented until it's a conviction. So you won't have that arrest data in a state unless it's been a conviction, or unless it's convicted. If it's pled down to something else, it won't be available as an impaired driving, a DUI. It could be something like a wet neg or something like that. Some of the privacy issues. There are some states that, with regard to citizens that are immigrating into this country, they will not allow any release of data or information that is attributed to the license. There's a multitude of different things. A lot of these agencies don't talk to each other. The data is not integrated. Even the court systems, sometimes county courts, district courts, state, judicial courts are not linked. If you don't have a unified judicial system within your state, then it could be very, very difficult for different jurisdictions to be able to monitor offenders. And we know that it's not outside the realm of possibility. Actually, it's quite common for somebody that has a DWI that they can get a subsequent arrest while they're awaiting adjudication for that first. So there's just a number. I could sit here for a long, long time to answer that question, but that, I think, kind of scrapes the surface.
Great. Thank you, Tara.
Well, I was just going to add, we only have 2 minutes, and Tara is absolutely right. We could probably talk about this for a long time. I will say that NHTSA actually has a project going on right now where we are looking at data linkages, but it's not the only project. This has been in the works for years, the challenges for data linkages. So I will stop there, and maybe someday we'll have a whole nother webinar on data linkages.
Great. We did have a question just asking about all the information from the webinar. It will be sent out via email to everyone that registered either this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So you'll get the actual recording of the webinar. You'll get links to the main documents that were talked about. And so you'll be getting all of that shortly. Another thing that I just wanted to bring up, a lot of what we've been talking about today involves legislative change, stronger laws, stronger or better use of the laws that are out there. And that's a lot of what NASID and responsibility.org work on regularly. And we certainly want to work with all of the states out there as we look at states to target and to help out in. It's always helpful to know that we have good resources in those states that want to get involved or want our help. And so we encourage you to reach out and let any of us on this call know, we all can tap into the right resources for you and get you connected with people that can help in your individual states or in your individual areas. And anyway, we want to thank you all for being here. I think we're about out of time. It's been a great webinar, and we look forward to doing more in the future and helping out everyone that tuned in today. Thanks to all of our panelists, and we'll see you sometime soon. Thanks.
Thanks.